Hello, testing. One, two, three. 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 Testing. One, two, three. Hello, testing. One, two, three. कैसे स्टार्ट करिए उसे मैं? Hello, testing. One, two, three. Hello, testing. One, two, three. Testing. One, two, three. Hello, good evening, guys. Myself Arjun. I'm CTO and the co-founder of company named Zujo. Basically, today I'm going to talk about why should anyone hire you. So the reason behind taking this session is I had been in recruitment and hiring in last 2 years, and I had more than 144 interviews last year 2019, and I had interviewed from fresher to managers. And what I wanted to share is uh, like uh, I don't wanted to share you like, how to make a resume or how to build your LinkedIn profile, right? And I'm also not going to mention that how to crack an interview or something like that. More or less, this talk is all about the in current situation, how we can reflect based on the scenario, based on the situation, and how can we improve ourselves, uh, and be a guy who can really change the current era of pandemic or current problems due to the pandemic, right? Uh, this talk is more or less connected to the history had been so far we had seen. What I'll do, I'm not wasting more time of yours. I'm directly sharing my screen, and I'm presenting my presentation, and meanwhile we'll talk about the same thing. Okay, so the topic, as I said, is like why should anyone hire you? Uh, I already given my introduction. Myself Arjun Kava, and I'm co-founder and CTO of Zujo and Homan. Zujo is basically a research-based company where we are developing one application which might change the education system, or we are much more focusing on changing the education in a better way. While the Homen is another company I'm related to, it is a non-profit company where we are researching on artificial general intelligence. I'll talk about more in depth after the session. I'm directly moving towards the major part of the session. This is the basic agenda I'm going to talk about. The first and the most interesting part would be like the brief history of the capitalism, right? And then I'll talk about evolution of the management system, and then course of those revolution. At the end of the day, or the last point I would cover is like skills we assume and versus skill we need. You might be thinking like, why do we need to understand all this stuff like history of capitalism or management system, course of revolution? Why, how it is connected to the current education system or current hiring or recruitment? Just bear with me. I'll explain that how it is connected, and I'll more or less explain that in history the same thing already had been happened, which we are facing right now. The pandemic we are facing, the industry. You might be aware of the layoff and the recruitment of in the current scenario, and how everything is changing, though the same thing had been happened in the history. And that's what I wanted to explain in this talk. uh, the talk is basically not connected to the majorly that how the process would be of hiring, how the process would be of recruitment, how to crack the interviews, or how to make yourself a great candidate of recruitment, right? It's never going to be, but it is much more focused on the fundamental of the skills where we can improve ourselves, and we can we can think a step ahead to change the purpose of ourselves to actually contribute in current scenario or contribute the growth of our economy. So let's get started. We'll start with the brief history of the capitalism, and what I'll do, I'll one by one I'll explain the concept which I have in my mind. So this is the basic graph of world GDP per capita. What I had done over here is like I had not created this graph first of all, or I had not came up with the data. World GDP per capita means like the capital of each and every person in the world from 1000 to 2000. So it's like a duration of 1000 years, where what I had done is like I had plotted the per person capita of the world. Like the graph or the research had been done by J. Bradford DeLong from the Department of Economics, UC Berkeley, and he had published his research paper in 1995, and he had basically explained that from 1000 BC to 2000, how the capital of the world or per person capita had been changed. As per the graph, you might understand that the x-axis is number of years, like from the 1000 or to 2000, and the y-axis describes the GDP per capita, like growth of GDP per capita. Now, in this 1000 years of context and a GDP per capita of per person, what I wanted to do is like I wanted to explain each and every part over here. If you might see over here from the 50 to, there is a three major part in this graph that I'll describe. This is the 50 to 100 ratio, then 500 to 1000, and then 5000 to 10,000. And at the end of the day, this is the 4 to 000, which is the per capita GDP in year of 2000. Now let's understand this graph by each and every perspective. Now, if we may start from the 1000, and from 13,000 to 14,000, you might able to see the downgrade of the graph, or downgrade of the GDP per capita, which is by end of the day productivity of a person. So this period is basically plague. So like in the 13th century, the Europe had faced the plague, and at that moment it hurt the current population of the world and productivity as well. Now, coming to the next part, you might be seeing the growth over here, but I'll explain in the next slide that how it's going to work basically, and is it relevant or not. Then over here, you might have seen the constant graph, constant increase in the GDP, and this point from 1930 to 1950, if anyone would have gone through the history class, they might understand that this is basically industrial revolution happened from 1930 to 1950. And if you remember the history as well, from the start of 19th century, 1910 to from the 20, you might have heard that Spanish flu had been there, which is like which the historian is comparing with the COVID-19, and they're also comparing the situation which is somewhere similar to the same part. Now, to relate this, what I'll do is I'll compare this both part, and I'm going to change the ratio of y-axis, and uh, this is the basic result. If I am grouping the both part from 50 to 100, 5,000, 500 to 1,000, and 5,000 to 1000, then graph would be like this. Why I had done this? Because you will easily learn about this crash as well as this crash. The both crashes are like the first crash is the plague, and the second crash over here is Spanish flu. As well as there are other constraints like the war and all those stuff, which I'll describe in the next slide. Now, this is the same graph, but it isn't grouped in multiple durations, or like multiple groups of 100, 200, 300, or 400. Now it is the graph which I had not changed, and I took the data from the DeLong paper. Now, from 1000 to around this cycle, if you might have seen that from over here, like 1930 to 1950, if you see this, from 1000 to the 19th century, it's like completely flat graph, right? And then from the 1930 to 1950, it's been growing, and after the 1916, it's growing like in exponential manner. Now it's like a proper exponential graph which can change the whole part. Now, if anyone could guess this, what would be the process over here in change of this graph? If I might explain the whole part. This point, you can easily guess that this point is industrial revolution and the capitalism that we had faced earlier, which is like which had been somewhere connected to the colonial part of British Empire, and they had started to revolutionize the technologies and other stuffs to make sure that will achieve the continuous growth. Now, from this flat curve and the constant growth, what had been changed exactly, which played a huge role over here to give the constant growth. If you see this 1000 to 1930, this flat curve is like it is because of the freedom people don't have, the sickness, the injustice in the society, as well as the force of smaller governments. I would say that the whole part had been done over here, and we as a human being had not grown till this part. The whole change had been proposed, or like I would specifically put the word over there, like had been possible due to the multiple reasons, like availability of the energy, as well as the availability of the cheap resources, technology, etc., etc. But if we go through this part, and if we analyze the exact curve over here, this is due to the entrepreneurship we had faced or we had invented in this world, which could be greater than the governments. If you might have seen the history, most of the most of most of the times the flatness if you might have gone through the history, the entrepreneurship had covered most of the markets, such as textile, oil, steam engines, or like I would say railroad or transportations, right? And whatever we did in this 1,000 years, right, had been uh, had been covered, or like had been measured in this constant growth. So like what kind of problems we had faced over here, we had not any kind of engine over there which can give us a better growth. But while over here we got the exit growth, a machine where we can basically get the growth in exponential manner, right? Now let's coming to the exit part of this behavior, or why it is connected to the recruitment or hiring we are going to talk about today. Okay, so due to the capitalism, we had invented five major parts over here. Like we had completely from the scratch, we had invented this in industries. Like first is textiles, then steam power, then iron making, invention of machine tools, and invention of transportation. Now, coming to the exact part, most of the historians are like explaining this behavior or this change in the economy, the reason of this constant growth. They are explaining it as a entrepreneurship, right? But now, according to this, if you've gone through the history, there is a huge role had been played by the managerial revolution in this curve. Suppose, let's take an example. If we see these industries as a startups, like let's assume that textile is a startup, generating steam power is also a startup. Iron making is a startup, and invention of multiple machine tools also a startup. And apart from that, transportation such as buses, roads, and railways is also a startup. Now, let's assume that these startups had been started with 5 or 6 persons, right? And they all are doing something to improve the economy, or like they are starting the things in Europe, first of all. Now, the vision of entrepreneurs had been to these companies, like how should textile would work, or like how should oil companies would work, how technology could help to generate the steam power, right? Or how iron making can be done, or invention of machine tools, or transportation, etc., right? If we consider this startup, and if we understand this whole part, and if we understand the scale of these startups, right? It had been started in Europe, but gradually it had been moved to America, and then other colonial countries, then in China, and then in last 50 years in India, right? Suppose the vision the entrepreneur had seen, most of the people had worked in this industry, had not or haven't a knowledge of how economy works, or like how management works. Like this the people who are working over here were generally are people who don't have that much good amount of education, as well as they are completely new to this process. Now, to scale, uh, suppose let's take an example, a textile as a startup, from scaling it to from the 5% to the 500%, we require some frameworks, right? We require something. We require some process which could handle the whole part, that how it needs to be worked, or how we can scale it, or how we are going to communicate with each other, right? How in multiple countries the same scheme of roads or same scheme of railways needs to be implemented. How can we distribute it, or how can we manufacturing it? When it came to 5% or 6%, it was easy to communicate, and it was like it was a very I would say that it was uh, completely easy to communicate with the people, to share the ideas, as well as to uh, to manage the things. But uh, gradually, when it came to multiple people, or it came with multiple geographical areas, things had been changed. Now, I'm just taking one example of this manager revolution, where uh, from the scratch, people had some of the manager roles, or some of the very innovative guys had designed some of the process, or changed the processes, which was completely innovative, and they had started it from the scratch, and they had invented the whole set of process which could be easily implemented by each and every organization, apart from that it is geographically divided. So let's first understand this just simple example of evolution of the management system. Then I'll much more describe that how manager roles had revolutionized the whole industry, and they had changed the whole part in multiple cycles. Okay, now this could be out of the topic, or this concept might not be connected to any of the recruitment cycle we had shown so far, but it is really really interesting to understand that how from the scratch this process had been started. And just be with me. After this topic, I'll give you the exact idea how it is connected with the current scenario, as well as current hiring and the recruitment. Okay. Uh, this is the basic scheme we had followed before the 19th century. It's a product, process, and external network. Any of the company, if you see before the industrial revolution, they have basic cycle of production, like the input resources, operations, output products, and the input resources they had attached it with the supply network, and output products had been attached to the customer network. And there is a pool of internal process, like from scratch to making the product from scratch to evaluate through the final product, right? And this is the very basic scheme had been followed by each and every organization throughout the throughout the couple of 100 years, right? And it has not been changed because of so many reasons. Now, let's come to the second part. When we had started the managerial revolution, the process had been changed to this extended process. Now, in this process, what is going on? Let me explain it. Like as name suggests, like extended process and customer intervention point. Now, the supply chain is a part of process, and demand chain it is also part of process. And now, if you might see this, uh, the customer intervention point where it had been connected to the reflection of the products, like how supply chain and demand chain needs to be reflect based on the customer intervention point. Now, uh, to take simple example of this process, most of the time with the old process, the companies don't have ideas that how supply and demand chain is working, or like what is the current stage of supply and demand. And there wasn't any intervention of customer network where they can define the same chain. This process had been extended to meet the requirement of supply and demand. Now, we move ahead one step in this process, and we had changed the whole part. Now, customer network is considered into the current process, and supply chain and demand chain also had been considered in current process as well. Now, moving next, if I would explain the better version of this, this is the next step: distributed process and outsourcing. Now, if you might seen over here, the whole supply and demand had been replaced by outsourcing. Outsourcing means like if you are buying a mobile device, most of internal parts had been outsourced by other companies. Like suppose I'm buying the Apple device, this the screen would be outsourced by the Samsung, or the I would say microphones or sound systems can be outsourced by other multiple companies. Now, this process from this supply to demand chain, one step ahead, companies had started to outsource their input and output production pipelines. Like most of the time, what they are doing is like they are just assembling some of the parts, and from the supply demand as well as from the uh, demand point of view, right? Or chain demand. Now, this is the one step ahead where companies have started to outsource each and every part of the product. Now, coming to the next, this is the third part: recycled process and global sourcing. Now, this is the common example in IT industry as well. This had been started with the companies such as Dell, IBM, where what they had done is like they had globally sourced the whole product, and there is a forward as well as backward cycle. Like suppose they are manufacturing any of the devices, there is a forward cycle of manufacture, and then also recycling of the same products with the backward cycle. And the global sourcing had been introduced over here. Now, this process is like much more easy for each companies, where they can on elaborate on their products. I'm not going to in details, like because this is not a basically manufacturing. This is not a session of understanding the manufacturing, how companies are doing. This is a session of how understanding the recruitment. But I'm just giving you the basic insight at how it's working. Now, moving to the next and the last part of this process cycle, we had started from basic scheme, then we moved to the extended process, then distributed process and outsourcing, and then we moved to the recycle process and global outsourcing. The only thing is like after this whole process, there is a final process had been introduced by the companies, which is like the evolutionary spirals, and you might know this cycle very well. It had been introduced in so many times in our study, as well as it had been introduced in software development cycles as well. Uh, Due to the dynamic supply demand needs of the products in current era, what companies have started is like they had started to integrate each and every process with evolutionary spiral, like a minimum version of the product, and then evaluated spiral such as final product, partition process, integrated process, extended process, distributed process, and recycle process. And again, they'll start from scratch. So each and every time, multiple process had been followed because like the change is dynamic, and we can easily understand the change. Now, if the reason to describe this process, like basic scheme, extending process, distributed process, recycle process, and evolutionary spirals. Uh, in your opinion, who were the guys who had designed these processes? Right? Because see, most of the people had worked in the industrial revolution are like they don't have any experience of how to understand human nature, how to understand the process, or if they had started with a small product, uh, where when it came to the scale, how to understand it or how to scale it, how to scale the communication of each and everything. Like if something is some part of the product has been manufactured in Europe and some part had been manufactured in India, how to manage those communication, how to decide that who are doing what and what is the basically outcome of this system. Now, if you might consider this on this point, if you will understand the whole era of capitalism and the downfall of Spanish flu, this process or this scale and this constant growth had been achieved by the manager roles in each and every organization. The guys who are different from others in that organization had started to think about the things we need to change. Like they had started to see the problems when it came to the scale, when it came to the manufacturing things or handling the supply and demand. What they had did is like they had understood the whole flow of the organization, and they had understood that what kind of need basically we require to 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 grow this organization. It could be textile, it could be stream power engines, or it could be anything you might have seen in industrial revolution. If you see the reflection of it, transportation, uh, each and everything had been implemented in multiple geographical areas. If we took the example of railway, it was also a startup. Like it had been started in Europe and then had been distributed in each and every other countries. Now, when they had started with only one city, it was really easy to manage. When it came to the multiple cities, it was tough. Now, when it came to the multiple countries and geographical areas, it's really hard to manage. And as per the history or as per the opinion of people, the actual change had been done in capitalism was uh, completely managed by the manager roles on those organization, where they had defined each and everything from the scratch, where they don't have any idea that how it's going to work. They had failed so many times with multiple things, or in my opinion, the all the things had been started in that capitalism was a simple startup, and this manager roles had made this startups to grow on the scales with multiple geographical areas, as well as handling the supply and demand of the whole part. Now, now coming to the exit point, why I'm connecting the whole thing into the one simple statement, like if we compare the same part or same thing, same capitalism with the current situation, you might have seen, if I'm going through the same graph, this had been a constant. This had been like, this is the era where which is like flat, and this is the constant growth. You can see the two outbreaks over here. One is flu, and second is one is plague, and second is Spanish flu. All World War II, basically wars. Uh, before the capitalism, there were a slavery. There were like war for food, war for geographical area, etc., etc. The reason being is like we don't have anything which could be successful on the scale, right? And after the capitalism, we get rid of everything because now we have a machine which can give us the exact cycle to grow, and which is the formula of like which can help humans to grow by himself. Now, this particular era, or like this change, this hockey stick, we can see the complete grow over here, and this grow had been achieved by the people who are really innovative or creative, and they're having uh, the skills to understand what kind of process we need to change, and what kind of things we need to understand to make a startup active in a global scale, or make a startup scale in multiple geographical areas. Now uh, I'm, I'm, I wanted to connect the whole part, the capitalism and the revolution of managerial things in one particular slide over here. Currently, if we forget everything, right? What we are thinking as a technical guy, or as a graduate from any of the industry, or any of the field. It could be computer, it could be electronics, or it could be human resource, right? Uh, we are assuming only two part over here in our skill set. The one is technical skills. I had defined some of the technical skills over here. The list might be very broad than this, but I tried to include some of the basic things over here, such as like bilingual or multilingual skills, in consideration of computer science. It could be web development, mobile development, UI UX, or programming. In consideration of other fields, it could be different, such as for manufacturing, or for other fields. Now, these are the technical skills we are focusing, or like we are getting education right now, right? Because it is the syllabus we are focusing, or like it is the subjects we are educating upon, right? Now, on the another hand, if I would describe the smooth skills of the person, which is like integrity, dependability, effective communication, and empathy, right? These are the skills which we require to have a better communication, or like to have a it is required to understand the industry, or to work in the team, basically. So right now we are focusing on this both skills, the technical skills and the smooth skill we require for any of the industry. And if you go through the history before the 19th century, and if you will understand the same scenario on a smaller scale, uh, each and every person related to the multiple work processes, they are they were supposed to do the same thing. They used to define the technical skills and the smooth skills. And what I see over here is like there is a huge gap in between, where which is the reason to 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 have a growth of that capitalism, which is the which could be a great chance for us to change the current scenario and evolve in this scenario. The skills I'm talking about is intellectual skills. What I mean by intellectual skills are like the skills which are not uh, which are not in your syllabus or in your study list, or if you would go through uh, Google, or if you would go through any of the courses, or like if you search like what needs to be done to crack the interview, you'll never find uh, the reason to get these skills. And what I'm talking about is like there is a list of the skills such as curiosity, problem solving skills, critical thinking, adaptability, willingness to learn, and emergent leadership. These are the skills which you cannot find to to have a course on the internet or to search for anything else. Now, let me connect the same thing to the two major topics I had described earlier. The first was the change in the capitalism, and the second was the manager revolution. If you might connect the both part, uh, the person who had failed so many times, like if railway had been started, if you go through the history, the project had been failed so many times, and again started from the scratch. The reason behind the scale of railway, textile, uh, uh, steam power, or any kind of source we are generating powers from, or anything else, this is because of the of some of this is because some of the person from a group, from in the startup, or in the in the organization where it was like it was 5 to 6 members, uh, had had thought about the problem they are facing to scale the organization, or the problem they are facing to make the things happen. These skills, curiosity, like curiosity, you will aware with this all this word. I don't have to explain these things. The only thing I would explain is emergent leadership, and in the end, that what it does mean. Now, if you will connect the skills, if any of the person would have these skills, can see the gap between this basic scheme, extended process, distributed process, recycle process, and evolutionary spiral. This is these processes are defined by the persons who really had intellectual skills, such as curiosity of learning the things, uh, problem solving skills such as manage the processes on the scale, critical thinking, which help them to analyze the whole organization, their goal, the vision, and uh, the reflection on the society. And adaptability is to work with each and every person in the organization. It doesn't matter if it is related to geographical area or not. Willingness to learn was another skill of those guys, which they had understood to revolutionize the whole system, and they had tried each and every time to start from the scratch. When it came to the from 5% to 10%, you always have to define the process from the scratch. And when it came to 10 to 100, you always have to learn that how things are going to work. And the last part and the most important is like emergent leadership. What I mean over here is uh, leadership is like the leadership which is which is powerless basically, which only had been required if on some of the geographical area we require to make a railway roads. The emergent leadership means like some person from the other geographical area came into the power to just understand the problem and solve it, and then move back to make sure that the group of people are understanding the same. So it does mean that it's a powerless leadership where the leaders are only trying to solve the problems rather than accomplishing or getting into the power, basically. Uh, so if you connect the whole part, uh, this this constant flatness and this constant growth, and if we find the reason behind over here, each and every person uh, who had made a change or who had contributed in the capitalism had all these three skills: technical skills, intellectual skills, and the smooth skills. Now, coming to the current scenario, if we understand the current situation of COVID-19, the same outbreak has already been happened, right? These two outbreaks. The first is a plague, and the second is of uh, Spanish flu. Uh, uh, if we will extend this graph, the same thing you might see in 1 or 2 years is this outbreak. Uh, After this outbreak, humans tends to solve the problems of multiple things. Like before this flatness, as in this flatness, there were slavery, there were war, and so many things are going, injustice and uh, colonies we had faced. These things are completely forcible to the human beings, and if we see this part, this is the freedom we had achieved so far. And if we compare the same thing, and if we compare the evolution of this management system, this evolution had been designed to accomplish this growth. And if we come into the same part, and if you follow the same rules, same if before 2020, if we take any of the framework from the history, and if you will try to implement that particular framework in this current situation, it never going to helpful. It would be like more or less the things we already had tried at that flatness. What we need to do is, as the start of the capitalism, people had tried to think from the scratch, using their intellectual skills, and tried to make new frameworks which could be helpful in the next capitalism, basically. The same thing I think would be helpful for us to overcome this particular situation, this pandemic. And I really believe that if we really wanted to get rid from this situation and the things we already had seen in this couple of years, if we wanted to solve this, the intellectual skills of each and every person, the managerial skills of those guys who are thinking differently from others and have this properties, can design a framework from a scratch which could be helpful to each and every industries right now, which are not able to grow in this current scenario. I'm closing this note or this topic on this slide. I'm just describing some of the references I took from the multiple research papers and multiple studies. And for this particular thing, what I so far I had explained that in the capitalism we had in that capitalism, what we had done so far was the scenario of handling the processing from the scratch, and uh, two major things had been happened over there, which had changed the whole industry and get human being a chance to have a machine which could not be stopped by anything. And if we connect the same history with the current scenario, what we require is the same thing in ourselves. What we require is, apart from the technical skills and smooth skills, we require a common framework of intellectual skills which had not been defined in any degree or courses so far, and which you cannot find in any of the current frameworks. And the same thing we need to do to overcome this pandemic situation and to get rid of this. I'm closing this part on this note, and uh, I'm uh, I'm also uh, uh, going to answer some of the questions if any of there. Let me first open a live stream, and I'll try to explain the questions if it would be any. Okay, I think so far there isn't any questions had been uh, asked. Uh, to close this point, what I'm going to describe is like uh, on the end node, what we require is a new frameworks of skills to overcome this situation, and what we require is intellectual skills in persons to uh, manage uh, a smaller version of each and every industries, and to make it happen on the scales, as so many industries had been affected due to the situation where we have to think about so many things from scratch. And in this process, what we require is a change of a framework. And I believe that those are the skills which we need to overcome this situation. uh, I'm closing this point over here, and if you still have any questions, you can ask me on my LinkedIn profile and just ping me, and I would be happy to answer this question. I would really like to thank GC Rajkot to give me this opportunity about explaining why should we hire you and what needs to be done in this pandemic. I'm really thankful to Sreya Doshi and Ravi Kansagra to help me with the live stream and let me know that how things are working. Thank you for this initiative, and I hope that it had been helpful to each and every person. Uh, Thank you for your time, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this session. Bye bye.